Hi, I'm Natasha Romano. 3 weeks ago, I was lying in a hospital bed at St. Mary's Medical Center, tubes running from my arms, machines beeping softly in the background, when I realized something that would change everything. My family had walked out on me during the most terrifying moment of my life, but they had no idea what they'd just set in motion. They thought leaving me alone in that sterile room would break me. Instead, it freed me. And when Dr. Margaret Winters, the chief administrator, saw what they had done, she didn't just call them back, she made sure they'd never forget the consequences of abandoning someone who deserved so much better. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights in room 314 hummed with that particular frequency that seemed designed to remind you that hospitals weren't meant for comfort. I'd been staring at the same water stain on the ceiling tile for what felt like hours, trying to count the irregular brown edges while fighting off the nausea that rolled through me in waves. The IV in my left hand pulled slightly every time I shifted, a constant reminder that my body had betrayed me in ways I was still trying to understand. It was a Tuesday morning in October when everything started unraveling. Portland's autumn rain drummed against the window with a steady persistence that matched the dull ache spreading through my abdomen. I'd woken up 3 days earlier, doubled over in pain so intense it had taken my breath away. But like everything else in my family, discussing discomfort was seen as weakness. My mother Patricia had dismissed it as stress from my new job at the physical therapy clinic. "You're always dramatic about these things, Tasha," she'd said, barely looking up from her morning crossword puzzle. "Take some ibuprofen and stop making mountains out of molehills." But when I collapsed in the parking lot of Cascade Coffee Roasters on Monday evening, my body finally refusing to pretend everything was fine, even I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and concerned voices, paramedics asking questions I couldn't focus enough to answer properly. All I could think about was how my grandmother's vintage locket felt cold against my chest, the only thing keeping me anchored as the world spun around me. The emergency room doctor, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes named Dr. Sarah Chen, had run test after test before finally sitting down beside my gurney with the kind of expression that made your stomach drop. "Natasha, we need to admit you immediately," she'd said, her voice gentle but firm. "Your white blood cell count is extremely elevated, and we're seeing some concerning inflammation markers. We need to run more comprehensive tests to rule out several serious conditions." The word serious had echoed in my head as they wheeled me up to the medical floor. I'd called my family from the ER, my voice shaking as I explained what the doctor had said. My father Frank had cleared his throat in that way he did when he was annoyed, and I could hear the television in the background. "Well, we'll see what we can do," he'd say. "Your mother's got her book club tonight, and Vinny has that interview tomorrow morning. Bianca's probably busy with her photography clients." Even through the haze of pain medication, something had stung about his response. Not concern, not worry, just inconvenience. But I'd pushed it down, like I always did. Maybe I was being dramatic. Maybe this wasn't as serious as it felt. They arrived the next morning, looking like they were fulfilling an obligation rather than visiting their daughter and sister. Patricia walked in first, her designer handbag clutched tightly against her coat, followed by Frank, who kept checking his phone. Bianca trailed behind them, already taking photos of the hospital hallway for what I assumed would become part of her latest social media project about life's unexpected moments. Vinny didn't come at all. "How are you feeling?" my mother asked, but her tone carried the same energy as someone asking about the weather. She perched on the edge of the visitor's chair, like she might need to make a quick escape, her eyes scanning the room rather than focusing on me. I tried to explain what the doctors had told me about the tests they were running, about how they were concerned about inflammation in my intestines and possibly my liver. The words felt thick and clumsy coming out of my mouth, partly from the medication but mostly from the growing realization that none of them were really listening. Frank was reading emails on his phone. Bianca was adjusting the angle of her camera to capture the authentic hospital lighting as she whispered to herself about content creation. Patricia was examining her manicure with the kind of attention she'd never given to anything I'd ever said. The doctor said they might need to do surgery if the inflammation doesn't respond to the medication. I continued, my voice getting smaller with each word. They're keeping me here for at least another few days to monitor everything. Surgery. Patricia's head snapped up, but not with the concern I'd hoped for. Instead, her expression carried that familiar look of annoyance she wore whenever life disrupted her carefully planned schedule. Tasha, you have terrible timing. This week is completely packed for all of us. Bianca has that gallery showing on Friday, and your father has the quarterly meeting with his business partners. The room fell quiet except for the steady beeping of my heart monitor, which seemed to be beating a little faster. I stared at my mother, waiting for her to realize what she'd just said, waiting for her to backtrack or at least soften the blow, but she just sat there, checking the time on her phone. Mom, I said carefully, the doctors think this could be really serious. They mentioned words like inflammatory bowel disease, or possibly something with my liver, they need to rule out. I paused, the next words feeling too big and scary to say out loud. They need to rule out some pretty significant things. Bianca finally looked up from her camera. Can't they just give you some medicine and send you home? I mean, you look fine to me. She said it with the casual dismissiveness of someone who'd never spent a single day worried about anything more serious than whether her latest Instagram post would get enough likes. That's when something inside me started to crack. Not break, exactly, but develop the kind of hairline fracture that spreads slowly until the whole structure becomes unstable. I'd spent 28 years accepting their priorities, understanding that my needs always came second to their convenience, believing that this was just how families work. But lying there in that hospital bed, scared and in pain, I realized that maybe other daughters didn't have to beg their families to care about whether they lived or died. I'm scared, I said quietly, the words escaping before I could stop. I've never been this sick before, and the doctors seem really concerned. I need you here. Frank looked up from his phone for the first time since they'd arrived. Tasha, you're being dramatic again. Hospitals run tests on everyone. It's probably nothing more than stress or something you ate. You'll be fine. His voice carried that particular brand of paternal dismissiveness that had been shutting down my feelings since childhood. The crack inside me spread a little wider. The doctor said my inflammation markers are the highest she's seen in someone my age. I pressed on, desperate to make them understand. She said if the medication doesn't work, they might need to remove part of my intestine. They're talking about consulting with specialists from OHSU because they're not sure what's causing all this. Specialists are expensive, Patricia said, her first real engagement with the conversation. I hope your insurance covers all this unnecessary drama. Unnecessary drama. The words hit me like a physical blow. I was lying in a hospital bed with IV lines running into my arms, facing the possibility of surgery, and my mother was calling it unnecessary drama. I closed my eyes and tried to remember a time when my family had taken anything about me seriously, when my pain or fear or joy had been met with anything other than indifference or irritation. The nurse Kelly Martinez came in to check my vitals around noon. She was young, probably close to my age, with warm brown eyes, and the kind of gentle efficiency that made you feel safe. How are we doing in here? She asked, wrapping the blood pressure cuff around my arm. She's doing much better, Patricia answered before I could speak. Aren't you, hon? Ready to go home soon? I'm sure. Kelly glanced at my chart, then at me, her eyebrows raising slightly. Actually, Mrs. Romano, the doctors are planning to keep Natasha here for several more days. Her test results show some significant inflammation that needs careful monitoring. She looked directly at me. Are you experiencing any increased pain or nausea since this morning? Before I could answer, Frank stood up abruptly. Look, we need to get going. We've got appointments this afternoon, and there's really nothing we can do here anyway. You're in good hands with the doctors. He was already reaching for his coat. We'll check in tomorrow, Patricia added, standing as well. But something in her tone suggested that tomorrow was more of a possibility than a promise. Bianca was still photographing everything, now focusing on the view from my window. This light is actually amazing, she murmured. Mind if I post this? I'll caption it something about the beauty of resilience or whatever. I stared at her in disbelief. She wanted to use my hospitalization as content for her photography business, turning my pain into her artistic inspiration. Bianca, please don't post anything about this. She looked genuinely confused by my request. Why not? It's actually really aesthetic. Hospitals can be beautiful in their own way. It's about finding art in unexpected places. Kelly had finished taking my blood pressure, but she was lingering in the room longer than necessary, her expression growing more concerned as she watched the interaction between my family and me. I could see something shifting in her eyes, a recognition of a pattern she'd probably witnessed before. "Well, we should really get going," Frank said again, more insistently this time. "Traffic's going to be terrible if we wait much longer." And just like that, they were gathering their things. Patricia leaned down to give me the kind of perfunctory kiss on the forehead that felt more like checking an item off a to-do list. Frank squeezed my shoulder in a gesture that was supposed to be reassuring but felt more like someone patting a dog they were leaving at a kennel. Bianca was still adjusting her camera settings as she walked toward the door. "Wait," I called out, my voice stronger than I'd expected. "What if something happens? What if the test results come back and it's serious? What if I need surgery?" Patricia paused in the doorway, her hand on the frame. For a moment I thought she might come back, might sit down and have the conversation I needed us to have. Instead, she sighed with the weariness of someone being asked to solve a problem that wasn't really her responsibility. "Tasha, you'll be fine. You always just call us if anything important happens." She said it like she was talking to a neighbor watching her house while she went on vacation. "What counts as important?" I asked, but they were already walking away. Kelly watched them leave, her expression carefully neutral in the way that healthcare workers learn to master. She came back to my bedside and adjusted my blanket, even though it didn't need adjusting. "How are you feeling?" she asked quietly, and something in her tone told me she wasn't just asking about physical pain. I couldn't answer right away. The room felt different now that they were gone, like the air itself had shifted. I'd expected to feel abandoned or hurt, and part of me did, but there was something else creeping in around the edges, something that felt almost like relief. I said slowly, "I think I'm starting to understand something I should have figured out a long time ago." Kelly nodded like she knew exactly what I meant. "Sometimes it takes being in a place like this to see clearly. When people show you who they are, especially when you're vulnerable, it's important to believe them." She was right, but it went deeper than that. As I lay there in the silence they'd left behind, I started thinking about all the times I'd minimized my own needs to avoid inconveniencing them, all the times I'd apologized for feeling hurt when they dismissed, all the times I'd convinced myself that their indifference was normal, that expecting more was selfish. I thought about my grandmother's locket pressing against my chest, and how she used to tell me that family wasn't just about blood, it was about showing up for each other when it mattered most. She'd been gone for 3 years now, but I could still hear her voice reminding me that I deserved to be loved in a way that didn't require me to shrink myself down to fit into other people's convenience. The afternoon stretched on with a parade of medical staff coming in and out. Dr. Chin stopped by to explain that they were still waiting on some test results, but that the inflammation markers continued to be concerning. A specialist would be consulting on my case tomorrow. The words should have scared me, but instead I found myself listening with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. When evening came and my phone stayed silent, I wasn't surprised. No calls asking how I was feeling, no texts checking if I needed anything, no follow-up from anyone who was supposed to love me most. I ordered dinner from the hospital menu and ate it slowly, tasting each bite in a way I hadn't done in months. That's when I started to understand what was really happening. This wasn't just about them failing to show up for my medical crisis. This was about a lifetime of them failing to show up for me, period. And for the first time in my adult life, I was experiencing what it felt like to not have to manage their emotions or make excuses for their behavior. I was still scared about what the doctors might find. I was still worried about surgery and recovery and all the unknowns ahead. But underneath that fear was something I hadn't felt in years. The space to just be afraid without having to comfort anyone else about my fear. As I drifted off to sleep that night, my grandmother's locket catching the light from the hallway, I made myself a promise. Whatever happened with my health, whatever the doctors discovered, I was going to pay attention to this feeling. This sense of what it was like to not have to apologize for taking up space in my own life. I had no idea that the next morning would bring Dr. Margaret Winters into my room, or that what she witnessed would set off a chain of events that would change everything. I didn't know yet that sometimes the people who see you clearly aren't the ones who are supposed to love you, but the ones who understand that love is supposed to look like something entirely different. All I knew was that for the first time in my life, I was learning what it felt like to not have to earn the right to matter, and that lesson was going to be worth everything that came next. Wednesday morning arrived with the kind of gray October light that made everything look washed out and tired. I'd been awake since 5, listening to the sounds of the hospital coming to life around me, footsteps in the hallway, the distant ding of elevators, hushed conversations between staff members changing shifts. My body felt heavy with exhaustion, but my mind was sharp in a way it hadn't been in months. Kelly came in around 6:30 with my morning medications, her smile warm despite the early hour. "How did you sleep?" she asked, checking the readings on my monitors with practiced efficiency. "Better than I expected," I said, and it was true. Without the weight of managing everyone else's reactions to my illness, I'd actually been able to rest. "Any word on when the specialist will be by?" "Dr. Patel should be here around 9, she said, making notes in my chart. "Your inflammation markers came down slightly overnight, which is encouraging. The IV antibiotics seem to be helping." I nodded, processing this information without the usual anxiety that came with medical updates. Yesterday I would have been frantically texting my family with every small development, seeking their approval for how worried I should be. Today I was simply absorbing the information and trusting my own ability to handle whatever came next. Around 8 o'clock my phone finally buzzed with a text from my mother. "Hope you're feeling better. Had to reschedule lunch with the Hendersons because of all this hospital business. Let us know when you're ready to come home." I read the message 3 times, waiting for the familiar surge of guilt that usually accompanied my mother's disappointment. Instead, I felt something closer to fascination. She'd managed to make my hospitalization about her inconvenience, even in a text message. The skill was almost impressive in its consistency. I set the phone aside without responding. There would be time to deal with their reactions later. Right now, I wanted to focus on understanding what was happening in my own body, in my own life. Dr. Patel arrived precisely at 9. A composed woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she didn't have time for anything but honesty. She introduced herself as a gastroenterologist and pulled up a chair beside my bed, opening a thick folder filled with test results. "Miss Romano," she began, "I've been reviewing your case with Dr. Chen, and I'd like to discuss what we found." She spread several papers across the bedside table, each one covered with numbers and medical terminology that looked like a foreign language. "Your inflammatory markers indicate a severe flare of what appears to be Crohn's disease, which is a type of inflammatory bowel condition." The words hung in the air between us. Crohn's disease. I'd heard of it but didn't really understand what it meant for my life, my future, my ability to work and travel and do all the things I'd been planning. "The good news," Patel continued, "is that we've caught this early, and there are excellent treatment options available. The concerning news is that you've clearly been suffering with symptoms for much longer than you realized. Your intestinal inflammation suggests this has been building for months, possibly years." I thought back to all the times I'd dismissed stomach pain as stress, written off fatigue as working too hard, convinced myself that the occasional bloody episodes were just hemorrhoids or something equally minor. How many warning signs had I ignored because acknowledging them felt like admitting weakness? "What does treatment look like?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. Dr. Patel smiled approvingly, like she appreciated patients who asked practical questions. "We'll start with a course of corticosteroids to bring down the immediate inflammation, then transition you to a long-term medication to prevent future flares. You'll need regular monitoring, dietary modifications and lifestyle adjustment. This is a chronic condition, but with proper management, most people live completely normal lives." Chronic condition. The words should have felt overwhelming, but instead they felt like an explanation for so many things I hadn't understood about my body over the past few years. All those times I'd felt exhausted for no reason, all those stomach aches I'd attributed to anxiety, all those moments when I'd felt like something was wrong but couldn't put my finger on what. I'd like to keep you here for another 2 days to make sure the steroid treatment is working, and to give you time to process all this information, Dr. Patel said. Do you have family support at home? Managing a new diagnosis can be challenging, and having people who understand what you're going through makes a significant difference. The question caught me off guard, not because I didn't know the answer but because I wasn't sure how to explain the complicated reality of my family dynamics to a stranger. My family. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They're dealing with their own things right now, I said carefully. Dr. Patel studied my face for a moment, and I had the feeling she was reading between the lines in a way that medical professionals learn to do. Well, we have excellent resources here at the hospital: social workers, support groups, educational materials. You don't have to navigate this alone. After she left, I sat staring at the pamphlet she'd given me about Crohn's disease and inflammatory bowel conditions. The photographs showed people hiking, playing with children, working at computers, living full and active lives. For some reason, seeing those images made me think about my grandmother and the stories she used to tell about overcoming challenges that seemed impossible at the time. My phone rang around 10:30. Bianca's name flashed on the screen, and I hesitated before answering. Part of me wanted to let it go to voicemail, but curiosity won out. "Tasha," she said, her voice carrying that artificially bright tone she used when she wanted something. "How are you feeling?" "Better, I hope. I'm getting answers about what's been wrong," I said. "The doctors think I have Crohn's disease." "Crohn's disease?" she repeated, and I could hear her typing in the background. "Is that serious? It sounds made up." "It's an inflammatory bowel condition," I explained. "It's chronic, which means I'll need to manage it for the rest of my life, but it's treatable." "Oh." The typing stopped. "Well, that's not too bad then. I mean, at least it's not cancer or anything really scary." The casual dismissal hit me like a slap. Here I was, processing a life-changing diagnosis, learning that I'd been living with a serious medical condition for months or years without knowing it, and her first response was to minimize it, because it wasn't immediately life-threatening. "Bianca," I said slowly, "this is a big deal for me. I'm going to need to change my diet, take medications long-term, and monitor my health much more carefully. It explains why I've been feeling so terrible lately." "Right. Of course," she said, but her tone suggested she was already moving on to other things. "Listen, I actually called because I wanted to ask you something. You know that gallery showing I mentioned? The one on Friday?" I waited, wondering if she was going to ask how I was feeling, or whether I'd be able to attend, given that I was currently hospitalized with a chronic illness diagnosis. "I've been thinking about the photos I took yesterday at the hospital," she continued. "The lighting in your room was really extraordinary, and I think they could be part of a larger series about finding beauty in unexpected places. I know you were weird about me posting them, but what if I used them for the gallery? I wouldn't tag you or anything. It would just be about the artistic merit." The silence that followed felt like falling down a well. My sister wanted to use photographs of me in a hospital bed, taken while I was scared and in pain, as art pieces for her gallery show. She wanted to profit from my vulnerability while I was still lying in that same bed, trying to understand what my diagnosis meant for my future. "No," I said, the word coming out sharper than I'd intended. "What do you mean?" "No," she sounded genuinely confused. "I mean, no, you cannot use photographs of me in the hospital for your art show. I mean, no, you cannot turn my medical crisis into your creative content. I mean, no, you don't get to profit from my pain." "Tasha, you're being dramatic again," she said, and I could hear the eye roll in her voice. "It's not about you being sick. It's about the universal human experience of resilience. Art is supposed to reflect life." "Then reflect your own life," I snapped. "Use your own vulnerability. Find your own pain to turn into art." "Fine," she huffed. "I just thought you'd want to be part of something meaningful for once." The line went dead, and I stared at my phone in disbelief. She'd managed to make my refusal to be exploited sound like I was missing out on an opportunity to finally matter. The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that I might have fallen for it just a few days ago. But lying there in that hospital bed, with medical equipment humming around me, and a new understanding of my own body settling into my consciousness, I could see the pattern with crystal clarity. Every interaction with my family followed the same script. My needs were secondary, my boundaries were inconvenient, and my emotions were dramatic, unless they served their purposes. I thought about what Dr. Patel had said about having support at home, about people who understood what I was going through. For the first time, I admitted to myself that my family would never be those people. They would always find ways to make my illness about them, to minimize my struggles, so they could avoid the discomfort of actually caring. Around noon, I heard a commotion in the hallway outside my room, raised voices, the sound of someone speaking with authority, footsteps moving with purpose. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone suggested someone was very unhappy about something. Kelly appeared in my doorway a few minutes later, her expression carefully neutral. "There's someone here to see you," she said. "Dr. Margaret Winters, our chief administrator. She'd like to speak with you privately." Dr. Winters entered my room with the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention. She was a tall woman in her early 60s, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, and sharp blue eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her white coat was pristine, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone who was used to being the most competent person in any room. "Miss Romano," she said, extending her hand for a firm handshake. "I'm Dr. Winters. I understand you've been having quite an ordeal here with us." "The medical care has been excellent," I said quickly, not sure why the chief administrator was personally visiting a patient with what was, in the grand scheme of hospital emergencies, a relatively routine diagnosis. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, settling into the visitor's chair with a graceful efficiency. "Actually, I'm here because of something that came to my attention yesterday. One of our nurses expressed some concerns about your family's behavior during visiting hours." My stomach dropped. Had Kelly reported them for something? Were they in trouble? Despite everything, the thought of my family being criticized by hospital staff made me feel protective and embarrassed. "I want you to know," Winters continued, "that what happened here yesterday is not acceptable, and it's not something we take lightly at St. Mary's." "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, though part of me knew exactly what she was talking about. Dr. Winters pulled out a small tablet and scrolled through what appeared to be notes. "According to the staff reports, your family visited yesterday morning and left while you were still in the middle of receiving serious medical news about a chronic condition. They showed no interest in speaking with your medical team, declined to receive updates about your treatment plan, and made several comments that our nursing staff found concerning." She looked up from the tablet, her blue eyes meeting mine directly. "Miss Romano, I've been working in hospital administration for over 20 years. I've seen family stress, I've seen people react poorly to medical crises, and I've seen all kinds of complicated dynamics play out in these rooms. What I witnessed through the reports about your family's behavior yesterday was not stress or poor coping, it was abandonment." The word hit me like a physical blow. Abandonment. I'd been dancing around it in my own mind, calling it disappointment, or poor timing, or just their way of handling difficult situations. But hearing it stated so clearly by someone whose job it was to understand family dynamics in medical settings made it impossible to minimize anymore. "I'm sure they're just dealing with this in their own way," I said weakly, falling back on the script I'd been reciting my entire life. Dr. Winters set down her tablet and leaned forward slightly. "Miss Romano, part of my job is ensuring that our patients have the support they need to recover effectively. When family members actively undermine that support, it becomes a medical concern. Your family's behavior yesterday created additional stress during a time when your body needs to focus on healing." She was right, and I knew it. The anxiety of managing their reactions to my illness had been almost worse than the physical symptom. The energy I'd spent trying to make my diagnosis convenient for them was energy my body needed for getting better. "What exactly did the staff report?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Dr. Winters consulted her notes again. Your mother made several comments about the financial burden of your hospitalization and expressed frustration that your illness was disrupting her social plans. Your father spent most of the visit on his phone and showed no interest in speaking with your medical team. Your sister was observed taking photographs in your room for what appeared to be social media purposes, despite your obvious discomfort. Hearing it summarized so clinically made it sound even worse than it had felt in the moment, but it also made it clear that this wasn't just my perception or sensitivity. Trained medical professionals who dealt with families in crisis every day had recognized that something was seriously wrong with how my family was treating me. The most concerning part, Dr. Winters continued, was their departure. They left while you were still waiting for critical test results, with no plan for how to support you through the next phase of your treatment. Our social worker noted that you appeared to be in distress after they left, but that distress actually seemed to decrease once they were gone. That observation hit me harder than everything else combined. Even strangers could see that I was better off without my family's version of support. I want you to know, Dr. Winters said, that this hospital has resources available to help patients who don't have adequate family support. We have social workers, patient advocates, and community programs designed specifically for people in your situation. My situation? I repeated. Young adults whose families aren't equipped to provide appropriate support during medical crises, she said matter-of-factly. It's more common than you might think, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. What is problematic is when families actively make the situation worse instead of simply stepping back. She stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the gray Portland sky. Miss Romano, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to take your time before answering. Do you feel safe and supported in your current family relationships? The question hung in the air like a challenge. For 28 years, I'd been trained to answer that question with automatic reassurance. Of course my family loved me. Of course they supported me. Of course any problems were just misunderstandings or the result of my own oversensitivity. But sitting there in that hospital bed, with a chronic illness diagnosis settling into my reality and the memory of their abandonment still fresh, I couldn't make myself say the words that had always come so easily before. I don't think they know how to support me, I said carefully. I don't think they've ever really learned how to do that. Dr. Winters turned back to face me, her expression gentle but serious. That's an honest answer, and it's a starting point. What I'm going to suggest might sound unusual, but I want you to consider it carefully. She returned to the chair beside my bed, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had thought through every aspect of what she was about to propose. In cases where family dynamics are actively harmful to patient recovery, we sometimes recommend what we call a therapeutic boundary period. Essentially, we restrict family access to the patient during the initial treatment phase, allowing the patient to focus entirely on their health, without the additional stress of managing problematic family dynamics. My heart started beating faster. You mean you would ask them not to visit? I mean we would inform them that their visiting privileges have been suspended due to their inappropriate behavior, and that any future contact needs to go through our social work department, she said calmly. This isn't a punishment, Miss Romano. It's a medical intervention designed to optimize your recovery environment. The idea was both terrifying and liberating. Part of me immediately started making excuses for them, imagining how hurt they would be, how they would react to being banned from the hospital. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger since yesterday, felt a surge of relief at the thought of not having to manage their emotions while I was trying to heal. What would that look like practically? For the remainder of your stay here, they would not be permitted to visit without prior approval from our social work team. Any medical updates would come directly from you, if and when you choose to share them. When you're discharged, we would provide you with resources for support groups and counseling services that can help you navigate relationships with family members who struggle to provide appropriate support. She paused, letting me process the information. I want to be clear about something, Miss Romano. This decision is entirely yours. But I also want you to understand that what happened here yesterday is not normal, it's not acceptable, and it's not something you have to tolerate just because they're family. I thought about my grandmother's locket pressing against my chest, and how she used to say that the people who truly love you make your life easier, not harder. I thought about how much energy I'd spent over the years trying to be the kind of daughter and sister who didn't inconvenience anyone, who didn't ask for too much, who could handle everything alone, so they wouldn't have to be bothered. If I agreed to this, I said slowly, what would you tell them? Dr. Winters smiled, and for the first time since she'd entered the room, she looked less like a hospital administrator, and more like someone who had seen this situation too many times to count. I would tell them exactly what happened, she said. I would explain that their behavior yesterday was inappropriate and harmful to your recovery, and that as a result, their visiting privileges have been suspended. I would inform them that any future contact needs to demonstrate genuine concern for your well-being, rather than their own convenience. The thought of someone in authority actually confronting my family about their behavior was both thrilling and terrifying. No one had ever called them out before. No one had ever suggested that their treatment of me was unacceptable. I'd been so trained to absorb their indifference and make excuses for their neglect, that the idea of someone else recognizing it and refusing to tolerate it felt revolutionary. I need some time to think about it, I said, though part of me already knew what my answer would be. Of course, Dr. Winters said, standing up. Take all the time you need. I'll be in my office until 6 today if you'd like to discuss this further. In the meantime, I want you to focus on getting better. You have enough to deal with right now without having to manage other people's inability to support you appropriately. After she left, the room felt different somehow, charged with possibility and heavy with the weight of a decision that could change everything. I looked around at the space that had become my temporary sanctuary, thinking about how much clearer everything seemed when I wasn't filtering every thought through the lens of what my family would think or feel. My phone buzzed with another text from my mother. Heard from Bianca that you're being difficult about her art project. Really wish you could be more supportive of your sister's career. I stared at the message for a long time, marveling at the efficiency with which she'd managed to make me the problem in a situation where Bianca had wanted to exploit my hospitalization for her personal gain. The gaslighting was so smooth, so automatic, that it had the quality of muscle memory. But this time, instead of feeling guilty or defensive, I felt something closer to pity. This was the best they knew how to do. This was the extent of their emotional capacity, and recognizing that didn't make me angry anymore. It made me sad, for the relationships we might have had if they'd been different people. I typed back a simple response. I'm focusing on my health right now. Then I deleted their text thread and set my phone aside. Whatever happened next, whatever decision I made about Dr. Winters' offer, I was done apologizing for taking up space in my own life. I was done making myself smaller so they could feel big. And I was done pretending that their version of love was enough when I was finally starting to understand what love was actually supposed to look like. Thursday morning brought the kind of crisp October air that made everything feel sharper, more defined. I woke up feeling different, like something fundamental had shifted during the night. The decision I'd been wrestling with since Dr. Winters' visit yesterday had crystallized into certainty while I slept. I wasn't going to spend another day managing my family's emotions while my body was trying to heal. I called the nurses' station around 7 and asked them to have Dr. Winters contact me when she had a moment. The response came back within 20 minutes. She would stop by during her morning rounds at 8:30. The efficiency surprised me, but then I realized that someone in her position probably dealt with family dysfunction more often than anyone wanted to admit. Kelly brought my breakfast tray with her usual warm smile, but I could see something different in her eyes today. Recognition, maybe, or the kind of relief that comes when someone finally stops pretending everything is fine. How are you feeling this morning? She asked, checking my IV site with gentle precision. Clearer, I said, and meant it. Like I can actually think about getting better instead of just thinking about managing everyone else's reactions to me being sick. She nodded knowingly. Sometimes the hardest part of healing isn't the medical treatment, it's creating space for yourself to actually focus on what your body needs. While I waited for Dr. Winters, I found myself thinking about my grandmother and the stories she used to tell about her own family. She'd grown up during the Depression with parents who viewed emotional support as a luxury they couldn't afford. I spent years waiting for them to learn how to love me the way I needed, she'd told me once. Finally realized I was wasting time I could have spent learning to love myself. At the time, I'd thought she was being overly dramatic. Now I understood she was sharing hard-won wisdom. Dr. Winters arrived exactly at 8:30, carrying a folder and wearing the kind of expression that suggested she'd already anticipated my decision. "Good morning, Miss Romano. You mentioned you wanted to speak with me. I've made my decision about the therapeutic boundaries," I said without preamble. "I want you to restrict their visiting privileges." She nodded, settling into the chair beside my bed with the air of someone who had guided many patients through similar decisions. "I'm glad you've chosen to prioritize your recovery. Before we proceed, I want to explain exactly what this process will look like." She opened her folder and pulled out several documents. "First, I'll be calling your emergency contacts to inform them that their visiting privileges have been suspended due to inappropriate behavior that interfered with your medical care. This is documented in your chart as a medical intervention, not a personal dispute." The official language felt both protective and empowering. This wasn't me being dramatic or oversensitive. This was a medical professional recognizing that my family's behavior was harmful to my health. "Second," she continued, "any communication about your medical status will now come directly from you if and when you choose to share it. The nursing staff has been instructed not to provide any information about your condition, treatment, or discharge plans to anyone without your explicit permission." I felt a weight lifting from my chest that I hadn't even realized was there. No more pressure to keep everyone updated, no more exhausting conversations where I had to justify my symptoms or make my illness sound more convenient for their schedules. Third, if they attempt to visit despite the restriction, security will escort them from the premises. If they become aggressive or disruptive, we can involve law enforcement if necessary. The thought of my family being escorted out by security seemed surreal, but Dr. Winters spoke about it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had seen every possible family dynamic play out in a hospital setting. "Finally," she said, "when you're ready for discharge, our social work team will provide you with resources for ongoing support groups for people with chronic illnesses, counseling services, and community programs for adults navigating difficult family relationships." She looked up from her papers, her blue eyes serious but kind. "Miss Romano, I want you to understand that this decision doesn't make you a bad daughter or sister. It makes you someone who's learning to protect her own well-being. That's not selfish, it's necessary." I signed the paperwork authorizing the visiting restrictions, my hands surprisingly steady as I wrote my name. Each signature felt like I was signing myself back to life, reclaiming space that had been occupied by other people's needs for so long I'd forgotten it belonged to me. "When will you call them?" I asked. "Within the hour," Dr. Winters said. "I'll speak with each of your emergency contacts personally. Would you like me to use any specific language, or do you trust me to handle it appropriately?" I thought about all the conversations I'd imagined having with my family over the years, all the things I'd wanted to say about how their treatment made me feel. But sitting there in that hospital bed, with a chronic illness to manage, and a future to rebuild, I realized I didn't want to waste any more energy on explanations they wouldn't understand anyway. "I trust you to handle it," I said. "Just please make it clear that this isn't a negotiation." After Dr. Winters left, I felt a strange combination of anticipation and peace. For the first time in my adult life, I was about to experience what it felt like to have boundaries enforced by someone other than myself. I wouldn't have to explain or justify or absorb their anger if someone else would handle the difficult conversation while I focused on getting better. Around 10 o'clock, my phone started ringing. First my mother, then my father, then Bianca, then Vinny. I let each call go to voicemail, following Dr. Winters' advice to let the dust settle before engaging in any direct communication. The fact that they were all calling so quickly told me that Dr. Winters had been efficient in her notifications. I listened to the voicemails later, each one following a predictable pattern. My mother's message was full of wounded indignation. "Tasha, I don't know what kind of lies you've been telling the hospital staff, but this is completely uncalled for. We're your family. We have every right to visit you. My father's message was shorter and angrier. This is ridiculous. Natasha, you're acting like a child. Call me back immediately so we can sort this out. Bianca's message was the longest and most manipulative. Tasha, I'm so hurt right now. I can't believe you would turn hospital staff against your own family. I was just trying to create something beautiful from a difficult situation. And now you're punishing all of us. This isn't like you. Someone must be influencing you. Vinny's message was brief and confused. Hey, Mom said you banned us from the hospital? That seems kind of extreme. Are you okay? Like mentally? Even their voicemails revealed the fundamental problem. Not one of them expressed concern about my health or asked how I was feeling. Every message was focused on their inconvenience, their hurt feelings, their perception that they were being treated unfairly. My actual medical condition was secondary to their sense of entitlement to access me. I deleted all the voicemails without responding. Dr. Patel stopped by around 11 to check on my progress with the steroid treatment. The inflammation markers in my blood work were continuing to improve, and she was optimistic about transitioning me to oral medications for discharge. You seem much more relaxed today, she observed, reviewing my chart. Are you feeling less anxious about the diagnosis? I think I'm feeling less anxious about everything, I said. It's amazing how much energy it takes to manage other people's reactions to your illness. She looked up from her notes with interest. Are you getting better support from your family now? Actually, I'm getting space from my family now, I said. It turns out that sometimes those are the same thing. Dr. Patel smiled knowingly. In my experience, patients recover much more effectively when they're surrounded by people who make healing the priority rather than people who make themselves the priority. Around noon, I received a text from Zoe, my best friend from college, who lived in Seattle. Heard you were in the hospital. Are you okay? Do you want me to drive down? The contrast between her message and my family's reactions was startling. Zoe's first instinct was to offer practical support. She wasn't asking for details to satisfy her curiosity or making the situation about herself. She was simply offering to show up. I called her back, and for the first time since I'd been hospitalized, I had a conversation about my health that felt genuinely supportive. Zoe listened as I explained the Crohn's diagnosis, asked thoughtful questions about my treatment plan, and offered to research support groups in Portland. When I told her about the situation with my family, she wasn't surprised. Honestly, Tasha, I've been worried about how they treat you for years, she said. Every time you'd visit them or they'd come to town, you'd be anxious for weeks beforehand and drained for weeks afterward. I kept wondering when you were going to realize that families aren't supposed to make you feel worse about yourself. It was validating to hear someone else acknowledge what I'd been slowly recognizing. Zoe had watched my family dynamics from the outside for years, unencumbered by the guilt and obligation that had kept me from seeing clearly. The thing is, I said, I always thought if I could just be a better daughter, if I could need less or ask for less or be more convenient, they would eventually learn how to love me properly. Tasha, Zoe said gently, you could shrink yourself down to nothing, and it wouldn't change who they are. Love isn't something you earn by being perfect, it's something you deserve by being human. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about the difference between Zoe's immediate offer to drive 4 hours to support me and my family's irritation at having to drive 20 minutes across town. The disparity was so stark it would have been funny if it weren't so painful. That afternoon, I started researching Crohn's disease support groups and found several in Portland that met regularly. I also looked into patient advocacy organizations and educational resources about managing chronic illness while maintaining relationships with difficult family members. For the first time, I was planning for a future that centered my own needs, rather than everyone else's convenience. Kelly stopped by around 3 to check my afternoon vitals, and I could tell she wanted to ask how I was handling the family situation. You seem lighter today, she said carefully. I feel like I can breathe properly for the first time in years, I said. I didn't realize how much energy I was spending on trying to manage everyone else's emotional reactions to my existence. She nodded understanding. We see this more often than people realize. Sometimes the sickest patients are the ones whose families make recovery about themselves instead of about the person who's actually struggling. Around 4 o'clock, Dr. Winters returned with an update about her conversations with my family. She settled into the chair beside my bed, with the air of someone who had dealt with many difficult family dynamics, but still found certain behaviors remarkable. I spoke with each of your emergency contacts individually, she began. Your mother was primarily concerned about what other people would think about the family being restricted from visiting. Your father was angry and demanded to speak with my supervisor about the hospital's authority to make such decisions. Your sister seemed most upset about missing opportunities to document your recovery process for her social media. The summary was both horrifying and clarifying. Even when confronted by a hospital administrator about their inappropriate behavior, none of them had expressed genuine concern about my well-being. They were worried about appearances, authority, and content creation opportunities. Your brother seemed confused but less resistant. Dr. Winters continued. He asked several questions about your condition and wanted to know if there was anything specific he could do to support your recovery once you're discharged. That surprised me. Vinny had always been the most distant of my siblings, but apparently he was also the only one capable of making my health the focus of a conversation about my health. How did they respond when you explained that their behavior was inappropriate? I asked. Winter's expression grew more serious. Miss Romano, I want to prepare you for something. None of them took responsibility for their action. Each person blamed you for being overly sensitive, accused you of manipulating the hospital staff, or suggested that you were having some kind of emotional breakdown that was affecting your judgment. The revelation stung, but it didn't surprise me. I'd spent enough years watching my family deflect responsibility to know that they would never admit to treating me poorly. In their minds, any problems in our relationships were always the result of my excessive sensitivity or unrealistic expectation. Your mother specifically asked me to recommend psychiatric evaluation, Dr. Winters continued. She seemed to believe that your decision to restrict their visits was evidence of mental instability rather than a reasonable response to their behavior. I felt a familiar surge of self-doubt, the automatic response I'd developed after years of having my perceptions questioned whenever they were inconvenient for my family. But this time, the doubt was weaker, dampened by the professional validation I was receiving from multiple hospital staff members who had witnessed their behavior firsthand. What did you tell her? I asked. I told her that your decision showed excellent self-advocacy skills and demonstrated a healthy understanding of what you need to recover effectively, Dr. Winters said firmly. I also informed her that questioning a patient's mental stability because they've set appropriate boundaries is exactly the kind of behavior that led to these restrictions in the first place. The thought of someone in authority actually defending my right to protect myself was both thrilling and surreal. I'd spent so many years being told that my boundaries were unreasonable that having them validated by a medical professional felt revolutionary. I need you to understand something, Dr. Winters continued. Based on my conversations with your family today, I believe you made the right decision about these restrictions. Their responses confirmed that they view your illness as an inconvenience to them rather than a serious medical condition that requires their support. She pulled out another document from her folder. I'm also recommending that we extend these restrictions beyond your hospitals. I've prepared a letter that you can share with your family when you're ready, explaining that your recovery requires a period of limited contact while you adjust to managing your chronic condition. The letter was written in official hospital letterhead, giving my need for space the weight of medical authority. It explained that patients with newly diagnosed chronic conditions often require reduced stress and increased autonomy during the initial adjustment period, and that family members who cannot provide appropriate support should maintain limited contact until the patient feels ready for increased interaction. You don't have to use this if you don't want to, Dr. Winters said, but sometimes having an official document makes it easier to maintain boundaries with people who don't respect them otherwise. I read through the letter twice, marveling at how it transformed my need for space from a personal rejection into a medical recommendation. The language was compassionate but firm, making it clear that this wasn't a punishment but a necessary part of my recovery process. Thank you, I said, folding the letter carefully. This makes it feel less like I'm abandoning them and more like I'm protecting myself. That's exactly what you're doing, Dr. Winters said, and protecting yourself isn't something you should have to feel guilty about. That evening, as Portland's October darkness settled over the city, I sat in my hospital bed, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, genuine peace. My phone had been quiet since the morning's flurry of angry voicemails, and I found myself hoping it would stay that way. I thought about my grandmother's locket, how it had become a touchstone during this entire experience. She'd given it to me when I was 16, telling me that it had belonged to her grandmother before her. Strong women in our family, she'd said, women who learned to stand up for themselves when it mattered most. At the time, I thought she was talking about standing up to strangers or fighting for causes. Now I understood she was talking about something much harder, learning to stand up to the people who claim to love you but treat you like your needs don't matter. Dr. Patel had scheduled my discharge for Saturday morning, pending one final round of blood work to confirm that the inflammation was responding well to treatment. I would go home with a supply of medications, a referral to a gastroenterologist for ongoing care, and a clear plan for managing my condition long-term. But more importantly, I would go home with a new understanding of what I deserved from the people in my life. I would go home knowing that my needs were valid, my boundaries were reasonable, and my health was worth protecting, even when that protection required difficult decisions. I spent Friday evening writing in a journal that Kelly had brought me from the hospital gift shop. I wrote about the patterns I was finally seeing clearly, about the relief of having space to heal without managing everyone else's emotions, about the fear and excitement of building a life that prioritized my own well-being. I wrote about my grandmother and the strength she'd tried to teach me, strength I was finally learning to access. I wrote about Zoe and the example she'd set of what supportive relationships actually looked like. I wrote about Dr. Winters and Kelly and Patel, strangers who had shown me more care and respect in 3 days than my family had managed in years. Most importantly, I wrote about the future I was beginning to imagine, a future where I didn't apologize for having needs, where I didn't shrink myself to fit into other people's convenience, where I built relationships with people who made my life better rather than more complicated. Saturday morning would bring discharge and the beginning of whatever came next. But Friday night brought something equally valuable, the quiet certainty that I was finally learning to choose myself, and that this choice wasn't selfish or dramatic or wrong. It was necessary, it was overdue, and it was the first step toward a life that actually belonged to me. The monitors beeped softly around me as I drifted off to sleep, my grandmother's locket warm against my chest, carrying the weight of generations of women who had learned to be strong in their own time and in their own way. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight brought peace, and that was enough. Saturday morning arrived with unusual brightness for October in Portland, sunlight streaming through my hospital window in a way that made the whole room feel different. Discharge day had finally come, and with it, the strange mixture of excitement and uncertainty that comes with stepping into a completely new version of your life. Dr. Patel arrived early to review my final blood work results, her expression pleased as she flipped through the lab report. "Your inflammation markers have dropped significantly," she said, settling into the chair beside my bed. "The steroid treatment has been very effective. We're ready to transition you to the maintenance medication and send you home." Home, the word felt complicated now. The apartment I'd been renting in Southeast Portland was technically home, but after 4 days of experiencing what it felt like to have my boundaries respected and my needs prioritized, the idea of returning to my regular life felt like stepping back into clothes that no longer fit properly. "I've scheduled your follow-up appointment for next Friday," Dr. Patel continued, handing me a folder thick with information. "This packet contains everything you need to know about managing Crohn's disease, including dietary guidelines, medication schedules, and warning signs to watch for. There's also information about support groups and resources for newly diagnosed patients." I took the folder, surprised by its weight. It represented a new reality I was still learning to accept, that my body would require ongoing attention and care, that I would need to become an expert in my own health in ways I'd never imagined necessary. "The most important thing to remember," Patel said, "is that this condition is very manageable with proper treatment and lifestyle adjustments. Many of my patients live completely normal, active lives. The key is listening to your body and not pushing through symptoms the way you did before your diagnosis." Listening to my body. The concept felt revolutionary after years of dismissing my own discomfort and convincing myself that physical symptoms were just stress or weakness. Learning to take my body's signals seriously would be as much of an adjustment as taking the medication. Kelly appeared in the doorway with discharge paperwork and a wheelchair, her smile warm and genuine. Over the past 4 days, she'd become something like a guide through this transformation, offering small observations and encouragements that had helped me trust my own instincts about what I needed. "Ready to get out of here?" she asked, though something in her expression suggested she understood that leaving wasn't entirely simple. "Ready for whatever comes next," I said, which felt more honest than claiming I was ready to go home. As she helped me gather my belongings, Kelly handed me a small piece of paper with her personal email address written in careful handwriting. "I know this might sound unusual," she said, "but I've been working in this unit for 5 years, and I've seen a lot of patients navigate difficult family situations during medical crises. If you ever need someone to talk to who understands what you've been through, please don't hesitate to reach out." The gesture touched me more than I expected. Here was someone who barely knew me, offering genuine support based on nothing more than human decency and professional compassion. The contrast with my family's response to my illness was so stark it might have been designed to illustrate the difference between authentic care and performative obligation. Winters stopped by just before I was officially discharged, carrying a manila envelope and wearing the kind of expression that suggested she had news to share. "I wanted to speak with you before you left," she said, closing the door behind her for privacy. "I've been in communication with your family since implementing the visiting restrictions, and there have been some developments I think you should be aware of." My stomach tightened with familiar anxiety, the automatic response to any mention of my family that I'd developed over years of managing their unpredictable reactions to boundaries. "Nothing catastrophic," Dr. Winters said quickly, reading my expression. "But your mother has been quite persistent in her attempts to contact the hospital administration about what she perceives as an overreach of authority. She's filed formal complaints with our patient relations department and has been calling multiple times daily requesting meetings with my supervisors." The information shouldn't have surprised me, but it still stung. Instead of using this time to reflect on their behavior or consider how they might better support me, my mother had chosen to wage a campaign against the hospital staff who had protected me. "What kind of complaints?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Dr. Winters consulted her notes. "She's alleged that our staff inappropriately influenced your medical decisions, that we violated her parental rights despite the fact that you're 28 years old, and that we're enabling what she calls manipulative behavior on your part." Each accusation felt like a small betrayal, confirmation that my mother would rather paint me as unstable than examine her own actions. The fact that she was attacking the people who had shown me genuine care made it clear that her primary concern wasn't my well-being but her own sense of control. "She's also been reaching out to other family members and friends, telling them that you've had some kind of breakdown and that the hospital is preventing them from helping you," Dr. Winters continued. "I wanted you to be prepared in case people start contacting you with concerns based on the information she's sharing." The manipulation was breathtaking in its scope and efficiency. Rather than accepting responsibility for their inappropriate behavior, my family was constructing an alternative narrative where they were the victims of my instability and the hospital's unprofessional conduct. Anyone who heard their version of events would naturally be concerned about my mental state and critical of my decision to restrict their access. "What did you tell your supervisors?" I asked. "I provided them with detailed documentation of your family's behavior during their visit, copies of the staff reports that led to our intervention, and a thorough explanation of why restricting their access was medically necessary," Dr. Winters said firmly. "My supervisors fully support the actions we took. Patient safety and recovery always take precedence over family convenience." She handed me the manila envelope. "This contains copies of all the documentation related to your case, including the incident reports, my correspondence with hospital administration, and the formal policies that supported our decision to implement visiting restrictions. I'm giving this to you because your mother has indicated she plans to escalate her complaints, potentially involving outside authorities." The weight of the envelope felt significant, beyond its physical mass. It represented proof that my perception of events was accurate, that my family's behavior was indeed inappropriate, that my need for boundaries was medically justified. Having that validation in writing felt like armor against the inevitable attempts to make me doubt my own judgment. Miss Romano has also indicated that she plans to be waiting for you when you leave the hospital today, Dr. Winters added. Hospital security is aware of the situation and will escort you to your vehicle if necessary. You have no obligation to speak with her or any family member if you don't feel ready. The thought of facing my mother immediately after discharge felt overwhelming, but not in the way it would have a week ago. Instead of the usual anxiety about managing her emotions and defending my decisions, I felt something closer to resignation. This confrontation was inevitable, and perhaps it was better to have it now, while I still had the protection and validation of the hospital staff nearby. I think I'm ready to face whatever's waiting out there, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. The discharge process moved efficiently from there. Final medication instructions, follow-up appointment confirmations, and a last check of my vitals before Kelly wheeled me toward the elevator. As we descended from the 4th floor to the main lobby, I found myself thinking about how different I felt compared to when I'd been admitted 4 days ago. The physical symptoms were manageable now, but more importantly, I felt like I was inhabiting my own life instead of just trying to survive it. The elevator doors opened to reveal the hospital's main lobby, bright and bustling with typical Saturday morning activity. And there, positioned strategically near the information desk where she would be impossible to miss, stood my mother. Patricia had dressed for the occasion in her most respectable outfit, a navy blue blazer, pressed slacks, and the kind of understated jewelry that suggested both refinement and wounded dignity. Her posture was perfect, her expression carefully composed into what I recognized as her reasonable person dealing with unreasonable circumstances face. She wasn't alone. Bianca stood beside her, camera hanging from her neck, positioned to document whatever reunion scene she had envisioned. My father was there too, looking uncomfortable but determined, his arms crossed in a way that suggested he was prepared for conflict. Even Vinny had shown up, though he hung back near the gift shop entrance looking like he wished he could be anywhere else. The sight of them assembled there, clearly having coordinated this public confrontation, should have made me feel guilty or anxious or overwhelmed. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Clarity. This was exactly who they were. People who would turn my medical discharge into a performance, who would create public pressure to force the outcome they wanted, rather than respecting the boundaries I had set. Kelly noticed my family immediately and tightened her grip on the wheelchair handle. "Would you like me to call security?" she asked quietly. "Not yet," I said, "but stay close." As we approached the automatic doors leading to the parking area, my mother stepped directly into our path. Her expression was a masterpiece of controlled emotion. Hurt, but dignified. Concerned but restrained. Exactly the kind of performance designed to make any observer think she was the wronged party in this situation. "Natasha," she said, her voice carrying perfectly across the lobby. "Sweetheart, we've been so worried about you." The endearment sounded foreign coming from her, like a word she'd learned phonetically without understanding its meaning. In 4 days of hospitalization, she hadn't called me sweetheart once, but now, with an audience of hospital staff and visitors watching, she was playing the role of the devoted mother concerned about her troubled daughter. "Hello, Patricia," I said, deliberately using her first name instead of mine. The small act of refusing to play my expected role felt significant. Her eyebrows raised slightly at the formality, but she recovered quickly. "We need to talk, honey. There's been a terrible misunderstanding with the hospital staff, and we need to sort this out as a family." Bianca raised her camera slightly, and I could see her calculating angles for the most emotionally impactful shots. The idea of this conversation being documented for her social media content made my skin crawl. "Bianca, put the camera away," I said firmly. "This is not content. I'm just capturing our family reunion," she said, her voice taking on that wheedling tone she used when she wanted to make reasonable requests sound unreasonable. "This is a beautiful moment of reconciliation." "There is no reconciliation happening," I said, loud enough that several people in the lobby turned to look, "and there will be no documentation of my medical discharge." My father stepped forward, his expression stern in the way that had made me back down from countless conflicts over the years. "Natasha, you're causing a scene. This is not the place for dramatics." The accusation of dramatics was so familiar, so predictable, that it almost made me laugh. Here they were, staging an intervention in a hospital lobby with cameras ready, and I was the one being dramatic for requesting privacy. "You're right," I said. "This isn't the place for dramatics, which is why I'm leaving." I nodded to Kelly, who immediately began wheeling me toward the door. But my mother wasn't finished with her performance. "Wait," she called out, her voice taking on a desperate edge that was probably genuine. "Natasha, please, we're your family. We love you. Whatever the hospital staff told you about us, whatever they made you believe, it's not true. We just want to take care of you." The words should have tugged at my heartstrings, should have made me feel guilty for walking away from people who claimed to love me. Instead, they highlighted the fundamental problem with stunning clarity. They wanted to take care of me according to their definition of care, which involved dismissing my needs, minimizing my illness, and controlling my narrative. Their version of love required me to disappear myself so completely that they could pretend I didn't have any inconvenient feelings or boundaries. I turned back to face them, still seated in the wheelchair but feeling more powerful than I had in years. "If you want to take care of me," I said, my voice calm and clear, "then respect the boundaries I've set. If you want to love me, then love me enough to let me heal without having to manage your emotions about my illness." "What boundaries?" my father demanded. "What are you talking about? We came here every day to support you." The rewriting of history was breathtaking. They had come here once, stayed for less than an hour, and left while I was still waiting for test results. But in their version of events, they had been devoted and supportive visitors who were inexplicably banned from seeing their beloved daughter. "Mr. Romano," Kelly interjected, her voice professional but firm. I was Miss Romano's primary nurse during her stay. "Your family visited once, for approximately 45 minutes, and left before receiving any updates about her treatment plan." The correction hung in the air like a challenge. Here was a neutral witness, someone with no investment in our family dynamics, stating the simple facts of what had happened. My family could continue lying to themselves and others, but they couldn't change the official record. Bianca lowered her camera, finally seeming to understand that this wasn't going to unfold the way she had anticipated. Vinny stepped forward, his expression more genuine than the others. "Tasha," he said quietly, "I don't really understand what happened, but if you need space, I get it. Let me know if you need anything. Okay? Like actually need anything. Not just what everyone thinks you should need." The distinction was small but significant. Vinny was the only one offering support without conditions, the only one acknowledging that my needs might be different from what the family had decided they should be. "Thank you," I said, meeting his eyes directly. "I'll remember that." As Kelly wheeled me through the automatic doors into the bright October morning, I could hear my mother's voice behind me, no longer carefully modulated for public consumption. "This is ridiculous," she was saying to anyone who would listen. "She's clearly not thinking straight. The medication must be affecting her judgment. This isn't like her at all." But that was where she was wrong. This was exactly like me. This was who I had always been underneath the layers of accommodation and people-pleasing, and desperate attempts to earn love by never being inconvenient. This was the person my grandmother had seen when she gave me her locket, the person Zoe had recognized when she offered to drive 4 hours to support me, the person Dr. Winters and Kelly and Dr. Patel had treated with respect and dignity from the moment they met me. My car was parked in the visitor lot, exactly where Zoe had left it after driving down from Seattle to retrieve it from the coffee shop where I'd collapsed. She had taken care of this practical detail without being asked, the way people do when they actually care about making your life easier rather than more complicated. Kelly helped me into the driver's seat and handed me the folder of discharge information. "Remember," she said, "recovery isn't just about taking your medications and following up with your doctors. It's also about protecting the environment you're healing in." As I drove away from Mary's Medical Center, I caught a glimpse of my family in the rearview mirror, still standing in front of the hospital entrance, probably planning their next move in what they clearly saw as a campaign to restore their access to me. But for the first time in my life, their planning didn't include me. I wasn't waiting for their approval, wasn't trying to anticipate their reactions, wasn't shaping my decisions around their comfort. The drive to my apartment took 20 minutes through familiar Portland neighborhoods, but everything looked different somehow, sharper, more vivid. like I was seeing the city through new eyes. When I pulled into my parking space and sat for a moment in the silence of my own car, I realized what had changed. I was looking at the world from the perspective of someone who mattered, someone whose needs were valid, whose boundaries were reasonable, whose health was worth protecting. My apartment felt both familiar and foreign as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The same furniture, the same layout, the same view of the courtyard from my living room window, but I was different, and that difference colored everything else. I set my discharge folder on the kitchen counter and made myself a cup of tea, following the dietary guidelines Dr. Patel had given me. As I waited for the water to boil, I thought about the conversation with my family in the hospital lobby and how it had felt like watching strangers perform a play about people I used to know. The realization that came next was both liberating and terrifying. I didn't have to keep trying to fix relationships with people who fundamentally didn't see me as a person worthy of basic respect. I could choose to spend my energy on healing, on building a life that actually fit me, on cultivating relationships with people who made my existence easier rather than harder. My phone had been mercifully quiet during the drive home, but as I settled onto my couch with my tea and the stack of Crohn's disease information, it began to buzz with incoming messages, text after text, voicemail after voicemail, the digital continuation of the scene they had tried to create in the hospital lobby. But for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel compelled to read them immediately. I didn't feel responsible for managing their emotions or providing reassurance about my decision. I placed the phone face down on the coffee table and focused on learning about my new reality, medication schedules, dietary modifications, stress management techniques, and the importance of building a strong support network. That last point stopped me cold. Support network. For years I had assumed that family was supposed to be the foundation of that network, that blood relationship automatically qualified people for the role of supporter. Now I understood that support was something you recognized by its effects, not its intention. Support made you feel stronger, more capable, more confident in your own judgment. What my family offered made me feel smaller, more confused, more doubtful of my own perceptions. As the afternoon sunlight streamed through my apartment windows, I began making a different kind of list. Not the endless task lists I usually made to manage everyone else's needs, but a list of what I actually wanted my life to look like, what kind of relationships I wanted to cultivate, what kind of person I wanted to become now that I finally had permission to become myself. The list was short, but each item felt revolutionary. I wanted relationships where I didn't have to apologize for having needs. I wanted to learn to trust my own judgment, without seeking external validation. I wanted to build a life that prioritized my health and well-being without guilt. I wanted to find out who I was when I wasn't constantly trying to earn love by being invisible. As evening approached, I realized I had gone an entire day without checking my phone compulsively, without anxiety about what my family might be thinking or planning, without the crushing weight of responsibility for emotions that weren't mine to manage. It was the most peaceful day I could remember having in years. That night, as I prepared for my first sleep in my own bed since the diagnosis, I held my grandmother's locket and thought about the strength she had tried to teach me. Sometimes I whispered to her memory, "The bravest thing you can do is save yourself." Tomorrow would bring new challenges, managing medications, adjusting to dietary changes, navigating the inevitable continued pressure from my family. But tonight brought something I had been searching for without realizing it, the quiet certainty that I was finally learning to choose myself, and that this choice wasn't selfish or wrong but necessary and overdue. The woman who had collapsed in a coffee shop parking lot 4 days ago had been drowning under the weight of other people's needs and expectations. The woman falling asleep in her own bed tonight was finally learning to breathe. 3 weeks had passed since my discharge from St. Mary's Medical Center, and the quiet rhythm of my new life was beginning to feel natural rather than strange. The Crohn's medication was working well, my energy levels had stabilized, and I'd started attending a support group for people with inflammatory bowel diseases that met every Tuesday evening at a community center near my apartment. For the first time in years, I was building routines around what my body needed rather than what other people expected. My phone had been remarkably peaceful during those 3 weeks. After the first few days of constant calls and increasingly frantic text messages, my family had seemed to accept that I wasn't going to respond to their attempts at contact. The silence should have felt lonely, but instead it felt like finally being able to hear my own thoughts without the constant background noise of their emotional demand. I had returned to work at Mountain View Physical Therapy Clinic the previous Monday, and my colleagues had been unexpectedly supportive about my diagnosis and the accommodations I needed. My supervisor, Janet, had immediately adjusted my schedule to ensure I could attend medical appointments, and had connected me with the clinic's employee assistance program for additional resources. The contrast between their professional compassion and my family's dismissive reaction to my illness was striking. It was a Thursday afternoon in early November, when everything changed again. I was finishing up with my last patient of the day, helping an elderly woman named Miss Chen work through exercises for her recovering shoulder, when Janet appeared in the doorway of the treatment room with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Natasha," she said carefully, "when you're finished here, could I speak with you privately? There's been a situation that I think you should be aware of." The word situation sent a familiar spike of anxiety through my chest, the conditioned response to potential family drama that I was still learning to manage. But Miss Chen needed my full attention for the final part of her session, so I focused on guiding her through the remaining exercises, while trying not to speculate about what Janet might need to discuss. 20 minutes later, I knocked on Janet's office door, my mind cycling through possibilities. Had my family contacted my workplace? Were there issues with my health insurance coverage for the new medications? Had someone complained about my performance since returning from medical leave? "Come in and close the door," Janet said, her tone serious but not unkind. She gestured for me to sit in the chair across from her desk, and I noticed she had a folder open in front of her that seemed to contain printed emails. "Natasha, I want you to know that we're handling this appropriately, but I thought you should be informed about what's been happening." "We've received several phone calls over the past week from someone claiming to be your mother, expressing concerns about your mental state and your ability to work with patients safely." The blood drained from my face as the implications sank in. My mother was now targeting my employment, trying to undermine my professional credibility as part of her campaign to regain control over my life. The violation felt breathtaking in its scope and maliciousness. "What exactly did she say?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the tremor of rage building in my chest. Janet consulted her note. "She claimed that you had experienced a psychological breakdown during your recent hospitalization, that you were making irrational decisions about family relationships due to medication side effects, and that she was concerned about your judgment when working with vulnerable patients." Each accusation was carefully crafted to sound like legitimate concern while being impossible to definitively disprove. The suggestion that my medication was affecting my judgment was particularly insidious, designed to make my employer question whether I was competent to do my job safely. "She also provided detailed information about your medical condition," Janet continued, "including specifics about your diagnosis and treatment that she claimed gave her authority to speak on your behalf about your fitness for work." The betrayal of my medical privacy felt like a physical blow. Not only was my mother trying to sabotage my employment, she was using confidential health information to do it, information that she had no right to possess, let alone share with my employer. "What did you tell her?" I informed her that we don't discuss employee health information with anyone other than the employee themselves, regardless of claimed family relationships, Janet said firmly. "I also told her that any concerns about employee performance needed to be documented with specific incidents and submitted through our formal complaint process, rather than through anonymous phone calls." Janet's professional handling of the situation was both reassuring and validating. She had recognized my mother's claims for what they were, an attempt to manipulate rather than genuine concern about patient safety. However, Janet continued, she was persistent and called back multiple times, eventually threatening to file complaints with our licensing board and contact local media about what she called our failure to protect patients from impaired healthcare workers. The escalation was breathtaking. My mother wasn't just trying to damage my relationship with my family or my sense of self-worth. She was actively attempting to destroy my career, my professional reputation, and my ability to support myself financially. The level of vindictiveness suggested someone who would rather see me fail completely than succeed on my own terms. I want you to know, Janet said, that none of these claims have any impact on your employment status here. Your work since returning from medical leave has been exemplary. Your colleagues have noted your increased focus and professionalism, and your patients consistently provide positive feedback about their experiences with you. The reassurance was more meaningful than Janet probably realized. After weeks of my family's attempts to make me question my own judgment and mental stability, having my professional competence explicitly validated by my supervisor felt like solid ground under my feet. There's more, Janet said, opening another section of her folder. We also received emails from someone claiming to be your sister, offering to provide evidence of your psychological instability in the form of photographs and social media posts that she claimed documented your erratic behavior. Bianca, of course, she had finally found a way to use her photography for something other than artistic expression, as weapons in my mother's campaign against me. The idea of my hospital photos being used to try to get me fired made me feel nauseous. I assume you didn't respond to that offer, I said. We immediately forwarded those emails to our legal department and documented them as harassment, Janet said, attempting to provide fabricated evidence to damage an employee's reputation is a serious matter that we take very serious. The fact that my workplace was treating my family's behavior as harassment rather than legitimate concern was both vindicating and sobering. It confirmed that their actions were crossing legal boundaries, not just personal ones. What happens now? I asked. Now we continue monitoring the situation and documenting any further contact attempts, Janet said. We've also prepared a formal response letter that will be sent to anyone who contacts us with similar claims, explaining our policies about employee privacy and the legal consequences of submitting false information about our staff. She handed me a copy of the letter, written on official clinic letterhead, and signed by the medical director. It was professional but firm, making it clear that the clinic would not tolerate attempts to harass or defame their employees, and that continued contact of this nature would result in legal action. I'm also recommending that you document these incidents with local police, Janet continued. This level of interference with your employment may constitute harassment or stalking under Oregon law, and you should have an official record of what's happening. The suggestion that I might need legal protection from my own family should have felt dramatic or extreme. Instead, it felt like someone finally taking the situation seriously and offering practical solutions instead of just telling me to work things out with people who had no interest in resolution. Thank you, I said, meaning it more deeply than I could express. Thank you for protecting me, and for not believing their version of events. Natasha, Janet said, her tone becoming more personal. I've been managing healthcare workers for 15 years. I've seen people struggle with family dynamics, health issues, and all kinds of personal challenges. What I've never seen is someone handle a difficult situation with as much grace and professionalism as you've shown over the past month. The observation caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on simply surviving each day and learning to trust my own judgment that I hadn't considered how my behavior might appear to others. But Janet was right. I had been handling everything with a kind of calm strength that surprised even me. You're not the same person who collapsed in that parking lot a month ago, she continued. That woman was overwhelmed and exhausted, trying to manage everyone else's needs while ignoring her own health. The woman sitting here today knows her own worth and isn't afraid to protect it. As I walked back to my car after work, Janet's words echoed in my mind. She was right about the transformation, but I was only beginning to understand the full scope of what had changed. The woman who had apologized for her own medical emergency was gone, replaced by someone who could set boundaries without guilt and recognize manipulation without immediately doubting her own perception. That evening,
I called the non-emergency line for Portland police and filed a report about the harassment at my workplace. The officer who took my statement was matter-of-fact about the process, explaining that employment interference and privacy violations were taken seriously, especially when they involved false claims about someone's mental health or professional competence.
We see this kind of thing more often than you might think, Officer Martinez told me over the phone. Family members who don't accept boundaries sometimes escalate to trying to damage the person's livelihood or reputation. It's important to document everything so we can establish a pattern if it continues. The idea that my situation wasn't unique was both comforting and disturbing. Comforting because it meant I wasn't overreacting or being dramatic. Disturbing because it suggested that family harassment was common enough that police had standard procedures for handling it. After filing the report, I sat in my living room with a cup of chamomile tea and tried to process the day's revelations. My family hadn't just rejected my boundaries or dismissed my medical needs. They had actively tried to destroy my professional life, using my health information as a weapon, and my sister's photography as evidence of my supposed instability. The level of vindictiveness was staggering, but it was also clarifying. This wasn't about them missing me or wanting to repair our relationship. This was about control, about punishing me for daring to prioritize my own well-being over their convenience. They would rather see me lose my job than admit that their behavior had been inappropriate. My phone rang around 8 o'clock, and I was surprised to see Zoe's name on the caller ID. She'd been checking in regularly since my hospitalization, but usually texted rather than calling, unless something was urgent. "Hey," I answered, settling back into my couch cushions. "Hey yourself," she said, but something in her tone suggested this wasn't a casual check-in call. "I need to tell you something, and I'm not sure how you're going to react." My stomach tightened with familiar anxiety. "What's going on?" "Your mother called me today," Zoe said without preamble. "She somehow got my number and wanted to talk about your situation. She spent 20 minutes trying to convince me that you're having a breakdown and that I need to help stage some kind of intervention." The invasion of my support network felt like the final boundary being crossed. It wasn't enough for my family to attack my work and my reputation. Now they were trying to manipulate my friends, using people who genuinely cared about me as weapons in their campaign. "What did you tell her?" I asked. "I told her that you seem healthier and happier than you've been in years, and that maybe she should consider why her daughter feels the need to protect herself from her own family," Zoe said bluntly. She didn't like that answer. I could imagine my mother's reaction to Zoe's directness. She was used to people either accepting her version of events, or at least pretending to believe her concerns were legitimate. Having someone explicitly challenge her narrative would have been shocking. "She also tried to get me to give her information about where you're living now and whether you're dating anyone," Zoe continued. "She claimed she was worried about your safety, but the questions felt more like surveillance than concern. The distinction was important. Genuine concern would have involved asking how I was feeling or whether there was anything they could do to support my recovery. Surveillance involved gathering information for purposes that had nothing to do with my well-being. "I want you to know," Zoe said, "that I didn't give her any information about you," but she was very persistent, and she seems to have a lot of time to dedicate to this campaign she's running. Campaign. That was exactly what it was, a coordinated effort to isolate me, undermine my credibility, and destroy the independence I had fought so hard to establish. The systematic nature of it was almost impressive in its thoroughness. "She's already tried to get me fired," I told Zoe, explaining the calls to my workplace and the threats to contact licensing boards and media outlets. "Jesus, Tasha," Zoe said after I finished describing the day's events. "This isn't normal family conflict. This is harassment. This is stalking behavior." Hearing it described so plainly by someone outside the situation was both validating and terrifying. I'd been so conditioned to minimize my family's behavior that I hadn't fully grasped how extreme their tactics had become. "I filed a police report," I said. "My supervisor recommended it, and the officer said they take employment interference seriously." "Good," Zoe said firmly. and I think you should consider getting a restraining order. This level of contact and interference isn't going to stop just because you ignore it. The suggestion of legal protection felt both necessary and surreal. 6 weeks ago, I would have thought the idea of needing court-ordered protection from my own family was ridiculous. Now it seemed like the logical next step in protecting the life I was building for myself. We talked for another hour, and Zoe shared that my mother had also reached out to several of our mutual friends from college, using the same script about my supposed breakdown and need for intervention. Most of them had been polite but non-committal, sensing that something wasn't quite right about the situation. The thing is, Zoe said before we hung up, everyone who actually knows you can see how much better you're doing. You sound clearer, more confident, more like yourself than you have in years. Whatever breakdown your mother thinks you're having looks a lot like recovery to the rest of us. After the call ended, I sat in the growing darkness of my apartment, processing the full scope of what my family was attempting. They weren't just trying to punish me for setting boundaries. They were trying to systematically dismantle the life I had built outside their control, targeting my career, my friendships, and my reputation with surgical precision. But as overwhelming as their campaign was, I realized something important. It wasn't working. My employer had protected me. My friends could see through the manipulation. The police had taken my concerns seriously. The independence I had fought for was holding, supported by people who recognized genuine care when they saw it. I pulled out my laptop and began documenting everything I could remember about my family's behavior since my hospitalization. The visiting restrictions, the angry voicemails, the attempts to influence my workplace, the calls to my friends. If I was going to pursue legal protection, I needed a comprehensive record of the harassment pattern. As I typed, I found myself thinking about my grandmother and the strengths she had tried to teach me. She had lived through the Depression, survived an abusive marriage, and raised 4 children largely on her own. Sometimes, she had told me, the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest. But that doesn't mean you have to keep giving them opportunities to do it. At the time, I had thought she was talking about strangers or casual acquaintance. Now I understood she was preparing me for the hardest lesson of all, that family relationships, like all relationships, had to be earned through behavior, not just claimed through blood. That night, as I prepared for bed with my new routine of medications and stress reduction techniques, I felt something I had never experienced before, complete certainty that I was doing the right thing. Not the easy thing, not the expected thing, but the right thing for my health, my safety, and my future. The woman who had collapsed in a coffee shop parking lot 2 months ago had been drowning under the weight of other people's needs and expectations. The woman getting ready for bed tonight had learned to swim in her own life, and no amount of family manipulation was going to pull her back under. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, and I was sure my family's campaign would continue and probably escalate. But tonight brought the quiet strength that comes from knowing you're worth protecting, even when the people who should have protected you are the ones you need protection from. I held my grandmother's locket one more time before setting it on my nightstand, thinking about all the women who had worn it before me, women who had learned in their own time and their own way that love without respect wasn't love at all. I was finally ready to continue their legacy of strength, one boundary at a time. 2 months later, on a crisp December morning that smelled of snow and possibility, I received a phone call that would bring everything full circle. I was at my kitchen table, reviewing patient notes, while sipping the ginger tea that had become part of my morning routine for managing Crohn's symptoms, when my phone displayed a number I didn't recognize with a Portland area code. Miss Romano. The voice was professional, warm, and vaguely familiar. This is Dr. Margaret Winters from St. Mary's Medical Center. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. Hearing from the chief administrator who had changed the trajectory of my life was unexpected, but not unwelcome. In the months since my discharge, I had thought about Dr. Winters often, wondering if she realized the profound impact her intervention had made on my recovery. Dr. Winters, I said, setting down my tea. Not at all. How can I help you? Actually, I'm calling because there's something I'd like to discuss with you, if you're willing, she said. It relates to your experience during your hospitalization, and some developments that have occurred since then. My stomach tightened slightly, the conditioned response to any mention of that time period. While my life had stabilized and improved dramatically, the memory of my family's behavior during my medical crisis still carried emotional weight. "I'd be happy to talk," I said, settling back in my chair. "Wonderful. First, I want to ask how you're doing with your health management and overall recovery. From a professional standpoint, but also personally, I've been concerned about your well-being." The genuine care in her voice was touching. Here was someone who barely knew me, checking on my welfare months after our professional interaction had ended. The contrast with my own family's continued silence was stark but no longer painful. "I'm doing really well," I said, and meant it completely. "The medication is working perfectly, I've learned to manage the dietary restrictions, and I've connected with an excellent support group. My energy levels are better than they've been in years." "I'm so glad to hear that," Dr. Winters said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I also understand that you've had to navigate some challenging family dynamics since your discharge. Our social work department has been monitoring the situation, as they do with all cases involving family harassment of patients." The fact that the hospital was still tracking my family's behavior was both surprising and reassuring. It suggested that their actions were serious enough to warrant ongoing professional attention. "It's been difficult," I admitted, "but I've learned a lot about protecting myself and building healthier relationships. I actually feel stronger now than I did before any of this happened. That resilience is part of why I'm calling." Dr. Winters. "Miss Romano, are you familiar with our hospital's patient advocacy program?" I wasn't, though the title suggested something related to protecting patient rights or helping people navigate the healthcare system. "We have a program where former patients who have successfully navigated challenging situations volunteer to mentor current patients facing similar difficulties," she explained. "It's particularly valuable for people dealing with family dysfunction during medical crises, chronic illness diagnosis, or situations where they need support establishing appropriate boundaries." The idea was intriguing. The experience of being abandoned by my family during my hospitalization had been devastating at the time, but it had also taught me invaluable lessons about self-advocacy, recognizing manipulation, and building genuine support networks. "I'd like to invite you to consider joining our volunteer program," Dr. Winters continued. "Your situation, while difficult, has given you insights that could be incredibly valuable to other patients who are struggling with similar dynamics." The invitation felt like a full circle moment. The hospital that had protected me when I was vulnerable was now asking me to help protect others. The idea of turning my painful experience into something that could help someone else felt deeply meaningful. "What would that involve?" I asked. "Training sessions about patient rights, family dynamics, and crisis support. Then you'd be available to speak with patients who request peer support, either in person or by phone. It's completely voluntary, and you'd never be asked to handle situations beyond your comfort level." Dr. Winters paused, letting me process the information. "I want to be clear that this invitation isn't charity or an attempt to give your experience meaning. It's a recognition that you've developed skills and strength that could genuinely help other people." The distinction was important. She wasn't suggesting that my trauma was valuable because it could help others. She was recognizing that my response to trauma, the way I had learned to advocate for myself and build appropriate boundaries, was a skill set that could benefit people in similar situations. "I'm very interested," I said. "When would the training begin?" "Our next session starts in January," Dr. Winters said. "It's a 6-week program, one evening per week, led by our social work team and several experienced volunteer advocates." As we discussed the logistics, I found myself thinking about all the patients who might be lying in hospital beds right now, managing medical crises, while their families made the situation harder instead of easier. People who might be questioning their own judgment, accepting inappropriate treatment because they'd been conditioned to believe that family love always looked like what they were receiving. "Dr. Winters," I said, "can I ask what made you think of me for this program?" "Several things," she said, thoughtfully. "Your response to an extremely difficult situation showed remarkable emotional intelligence and self-preservation instincts. But more than that, you never became bitter or vengeful. You simply learned to protect yourself while maintaining your capacity for compassion." She was right about the absence of bitterness. While my family's behavior had been devastating,
I had never wished them harm. I simply wanted them to stop harming me, and when they couldn't, or wouldn't do that, I had learned to create the distance necessary to protect myself. There's something else, Dr. Winters added. We recently had a patient in a very similar situation to your young woman, chronic illness diagnosis, family members who were making her recovery much more difficult. When our social worker was explaining the visiting restriction options to her, she asked if she could speak with someone who had been through something similar. The image of another woman in a hospital bed, scared and overwhelmed by both illness and family dysfunction, made my chest tighten with empathy. Did you help her? I asked. We did, using many of the same interventions we used in your case. But having someone who could speak from personal experience about what recovery looked like on the other side would have been invaluable. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering the details of the volunteer program and answering my questions about confidentiality, boundaries, and support for the volunteers themselves. By the time we hung up, I had committed to attending the January training session. That evening, I called Zoe to tell her about the opportunity. She was enthusiastic and unsurprised. Of course they asked you, she said. Tasha, you've become someone completely different over the past few months. Not different like you've changed your personality, but different like you've finally become who you actually are underneath all the people-pleasing and family management. Her observation resonated deeply. I had spent so many years trying to be the daughter and sister who didn't cause problems that I had lost track of who I was when I wasn't performing that role. The medical crisis had stripped away all the pretense and forced me to discover what was left when I stopped trying to earn love through accommodation. I keep thinking about that woman Dr. Winters mentioned, I told Zoe. How scared she must have been, dealing with a diagnosis and realizing that her family wasn't going to support her the way she needed. And now she'll have someone who can tell her that it's possible to not just survive that situation, but to thrive because of the strength you discover in yourself, Zoe said. That's pretty amazing. Over the following weeks, as I prepared for the volunteer training, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this point. The woman who had collapsed in a coffee shop parking lot 6 months ago had been drowning under the weight of unrecognized illness and unacknowledged family dysfunction. She had been so focused on managing everyone else's comfort that she had ignored her own body's desperate signals for help. The woman preparing to help other patients navigate similar crises had learned to listen to her body, trust her instincts, and protect her own well-being, without guilt. She had discovered that authentic relationships were characterized by mutual respect and genuine concern, not just shared DNA or long history. My family had maintained their silence since the police report and the formal warnings from my workplace. Whether they had finally understood that their behavior was unacceptable, or simply realized that their tactics weren't working, the harassment had stopped. I occasionally heard updates through mutual acquaintances. Bianca was still pursuing her photography career, my parents were still managing their social calendar, Vinny was still working at his marketing job. Their lives had apparently continued unchanged by my absence, which was both hurtful and liberating. Hurtful because it confirmed that my role in the family had been more about what I provided than who I was. Liberating because it proved that they didn't actually need me to manage their emotions or minimize myself for their comfort. The volunteer training program exceeded my expectations in every way. The social workers who led the sessions were skilled at creating an environment where volunteers could process their own experiences while learning to support others. The other volunteers came from diverse backgrounds, but shared similar stories of learning to prioritize their own well-being in the face of family resistance. During one particularly powerful session, we role-played difficult conversations with patients whose families were undermining their recovery. I found myself drawing on skills I had developed through necessity, how to recognize gaslighting, how to validate someone's perceptions when others were telling them they were wrong, how to explain that setting boundaries wasn't selfish but necessary for healing. You have a natural gift for this, said Linda, the social worker leading our training group. You manage to be both validating and empowering without minimizing the difficulty of what people are going through. The feedback meant more to me than she probably realized. For so many years, my emotional intelligence had been used primarily to manage my family's dysfunction. Learning to use those same skills to help people protect themselves felt like reclaiming something that had always belonged to me. My first official volunteer assignment came in February. A 24-year-old woman named Jessica had been diagnosed with lupus and was struggling with her family's refusal to accept the seriousness of her condition. Her parents kept insisting that she was exaggerating her symptoms for attention, and her siblings were pressuring her to skip medical appointments to attend family gatherings. When I walked into Jessica's hospital room, I saw myself 6 months earlier, scared, exhausted, and desperately trying to convince people who should have loved her that her needs were legitimate. "I don't know if I'm crazy or if they're crazy," she said after I introduced myself and explained why I was there. "Everyone keeps telling me that families are supposed to support each other, but I feel worse after every conversation with." "You're not crazy," I said, settling into the chair beside her bed, "and the fact that you feel worse after talking to them tells you everything you need to know about whether their support is actually helpful." Over the next hour I shared pieces of my own experience, and listened to Jessica describe the specific ways her family was undermining her health management. The parallels were striking: the dismissal of symptoms, the guilt trips about inconveniencing others, the suggestion that she was being dramatic or attention-seeking. "The hardest part," Jessica said, "is that I love them. I don't want to hurt them or push them away. But I also can't keep trying to manage their emotions while I'm trying to figure out how to live with a chronic illness. Loving them doesn't mean you have to accept treatment that makes your life harder." Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is protect yourself so that you can eventually have healthier relationships with them if they're willing to learn. By the end of our conversation, Jessica had decided to implement visiting restrictions, similar to what I had used. She was nervous but determined, recognizing that her recovery had to be the priority even if it temporarily disappointed her family. "Will you come back to talk again?" she asked as I prepared to leave. "As often as you'd like," I promised. Recovery isn't something you have to figure out alone. Walking out of St. Mary's Medical Center that day, I felt a profound sense of completion. The place where I had experienced one of the most difficult periods of my life had become a place where I could help others navigate similar challenges. The pain I had endured had been transformed into purpose, not because the pain was necessary or valuable in itself, but because my response to it had taught me skills that could benefit others. 6 months after my hospitalization, I had built a life that centered my own well-being, while maintaining my capacity to care for others. I had learned to recognize authentic support and reject anything that masqueraded as love while making me feel smaller or less worthy. Most importantly, I had discovered that the strength I needed had been inside me all along, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. My family's abandonment during my medical crisis had been devastating, but it had also cleared the space for me to finally meet myself and to like the person I found there. The woman who smiled at me from my reflection in the hospital's glass doors was someone I was proud to be: strong without being bitter, boundaried without being closed off, compassionate without being self-sacrificing. She was someone my grandmother would have recognized and celebrated, someone who honored the Lockett's legacy while writing her own story of resilience. As I drove home through Portland's February afternoon light, I thought about Jessica beginning her own journey towards self-advocacy and boundary setting. Tomorrow she would face difficult conversations with her family, just as I had faced mine months earlier. But she wouldn't face them alone, and she would have the knowledge that recovery was possible, that strength could be found even in the most painful circumstances, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is choose to save yourself. The cycle of strength was continuing, passed from one woman to another, each of us learning in our own time that we were worth protecting, worth advocating for, and worth the difficult work of building lives that truly belong to us. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.